Well, good afternoon. My name is Ian Houston. I'm the Executive Director of the American Foreign Service Association. Thank you so much for being here at AFSA today. We certainly welcome everyone. We still have some coming in, and so we have a lot of interest in this topic. And we have a very talented and experienced group of individuals here with us today. We thank you for being here. Today's topic on the Arab Spring and the revolutions from last year is very much in conjunction with the issue that was in our May Foreign Service Journal. So if you wish to get a copy of the journal and you have not received it, we do have copies in the back. And we just want to be sure that you're all aware that we are recording this session. And if you do have any questions and answers, that you go to this microphone right here up at the front. We do that because we record it, and if we don't have you on the microphone, we won't be able to capture the audio appropriately. So when the time comes for Q&A, please go to the microphone. And with that, I would just like to turn the program over to Susan Johnson, who's the president of the American Foreign Service Association. Susan.
Thank you very much, Ian, and welcome to all of you. As Ian says, it's a pleasure. We enjoy these programs and the conversation that takes place. My role here is really just to very briefly introduce our guests, and I could say they don't need much introduction, and also you have their bio statements there on your chairs. So I'll just say really a few words. Many of you know Ambassador Gene Cretz, who's finishing up his tour, I guess, or have you finished it? Finished the tour already, okay. When we started the program, you were still finishing. Finished your tour as a U.S. ambassador to Libya, and he'll be headed off to Ghana shortly to serve as ambassador there in Accra. Ambassador Margaret Scobey served as the U.S. ambassador to Egypt during the sort of dramatic downfall of Hosni Mubarak last year, and one of the largest, or perhaps the largest ever, evacuation of our embassy. I was on this side, and so AFSA got involved a little bit with some issues of the evacuation. And today she's serving as Deputy Commandant of the National War College. Victoria Taylor served in Tunisia recently and wrote an excellent article on the post-Arab Spring in Tunisia for the May Foreign Service Journal that Ian brought to your attention if you haven't already seen it. And she's currently an International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations office here in Washington. And last, but by no means least, because he's an experienced hand at all of this, is our moderator, Ambassador David Newton. It's been a long time since David and I, since my NEA days, and that goes back a few decades, but there are very few in the Foreign Service who can match his Middle East experience. He was ambassador to both Iraq and Yemen and has spent a total of 22 plus years serving in the Middle East. So I know he will do an excellent job moderating this conversation. So now, David, I'd like to pass the floor to you so we can get started. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. I have spent a lot of time in the Middle East, but I've also been away from the area a lot, so it's really going to be the three practitioners who will tell you what's happening. This is the start, I think, of a very challenging decade for the American Foreign Service, for embassies, and for American diplomacy in the region. I sort of got an idea of this last April. I went up to Syracuse to give a talk on what had turned into a talk on the Arab Spring, and I was greeted with a spring shower, freezing rain and hail in Syracuse, and maybe we're in for something like that over the next decade here. We'll have to see. But this is a very interesting time, and if you forgive just a little bit of introduction history, when you think about the last time something like this happened in the Middle East, again a great challenge, the 1950s, where we had a fairly slow upheaval of revolutions, starting with Egypt, with the departure of King Farouk, going through Syria, Iraq, all the way up to Libya 17 years later. Yet when it happened in each country, even though this procedure had been slow, we moved very quickly into Arab nationalist authoritarian governments headed by military figures. This, in a way, this challenge is quite different. We've had an amazingly rapid change, at least in these three countries, one right after another, but perhaps with the idea that what comes out of this, instead of being fast the way it was in the 1950s and 60s, is likely to be very slow and painful and difficult to do. If you think back, I'm not that old that I was around when this happened in the 50s, but I came to the Middle East in '64, was there until '97. And you could see these governments, which started out full of promises, full of life. They were going to liberate Palestine, bring tremendous development, slowly peter away. They failed in all these respects. They did a good bit of development, but eventually they got older, more corrupt, more out of touch. And although no one could really have foreseen what was happening, you could see the trend that was coming. And of course, one of the specific developments, I think, which accelerated this was the change in information. These countries all had a monopoly on information until Al Jazeera and others came along, until the internet came along. And then we discovered, I think, with the latest events, until the social media came along, which really revolutionized things. But I thought it would be good to start, and I think we've all sort of thought this is a good way to start. Talk about the direct experience of these three experts. What did they see developing in their countries? What was predictable? Much, of course, was surprising. But how did the Foreign Service, how did embassies deal with these problems? And how did they react to these sudden changes? Let's start maybe with Ambassador Scobey. Would you like to talk about Egypt?
Sure. Although I think we all have to give recognition that Tunisia actually was the spark that I think set so much of this in motion. But certainly I cannot claim, I don't think any people following Egypt predicted the incredible quickness of the collapse of the regime and what transpired in Egypt. Although the combustible elements of what in fact combusted, blew up on them, were clearly identifiable for some time before. Even Secretary Clinton, when she was in Doha, I think in late December or early January, was talking about the foundations of these regimes being on sand. So there was a clear recognition of some of the underlying weaknesses in Egypt. The months leading up to this, again, no particular single event saying there was going to be a sudden change of political direction. But you had the previous summer a very disturbing case of abuse of police power in Alexandria, where abuse of police power in Alexandria, where the police gave a completely uncredible account of what happened. This Facebook movement actually mobilized people both in Cairo and Alexandria for weeks, and they demanded and eventually forced the government to reopen the investigation, even exhuming the body for investigation. You had an incredibly bad parliamentary election in November, where literally no one from any opposition group was able to win a single seat. You had continuing uncertainty over presidential succession, and you had a lot of economic pain, both the long-term problems of poverty in Egypt as well as rising commodities. So all the combustible elements were there, but I think very much it was the Tunisian spark that really coalesced this. And our embassy was, in fact, watching this happen. We had never particularly planned for this event, but I have to give great credit to the incredible leadership of the senior and mid-level and all the officers and their families in Egypt, who were able to look to the circumstances and figure out what to do, both to keep our community safe, to keep the American citizen community safe, and to try to figure out what was going on politically in the country. But this took literally everyone working around the clock for a number of weeks.
Could I just ask, we saw a great deal of Tahrir Square, Liberation Square. Was the embassy able to get much of a feel what that great large mass of Egyptians felt out in the villages? and far away from the cities?
That was very difficult. We were not moving around the country at all during that particular period. After the police collapsed, there were curfews that were at nightfall for a certain period of time, so our ability to move around, even Cairo, was curtailed, and getting outside of the city was really not very much a possibility. However, people did have contacts. We had phone calls. Our consular people, our political and economic officers were certainly in touch with contacts throughout Egypt. But and of course the wonder of television, of being able to watch it live with everyone else.
Yeah. Let me ask you, Ms. David, you are an expert on a much smaller country, probably a much, on the whole, better educated, more European country. And of course, as Margaret said, that's where it all started. How was the embassy positioned for that? And, I mean, this had become very much a police state under Ben Ali. Was the embassy able to get around the country to sample opinion? What were the challenges?
Well, of course, I'm coming from a different perspective, having served in Tunis prior to the revolution. I was there from 2006 to 2008, working in the political and economic sections. And so I can say that while I think for most people, Tunisia is not often in the headlines, and it must have come as a huge surprise throughout the world because the image that Ben Ali regime tried to portray was one of a very stable country, peaceful, beautiful, a tourist haven. But for anyone who had spent any time there, and for those of us who worked there, we knew that beneath the surface, the model had a lot of cracks. And I think even in 2006, 2008, when I was there, the embassy was well aware that the model as it existed was not going to be sustainable in the long run. It was clear at that time that the economic problems, unemployment, corruption, were really starting to breed a lot of social unrest. And then even in 2008, you were seeing some limited protests in the inland of Tunisia, kind of responding to those pressures. And while I think that it's clear that the revolution was very much political, I think it's hard to separate those political and economic factors because even the economic problems in Tunisia really stemmed from that dictatorship. And I think that, kind of taking it back to the role of the Foreign Service, I think at that time we did have a very good handle on the situation in the country, and I think that we did play an important role for the opposition and the civil society at that time in trying to provide as much support as we could in this police state and very oppressive environment. I had the opportunity to go back to Tunis in February, and I met with some of the opposition and journalist leaders that we used to speak to when I served there. And a lot of them told me how much they had really appreciated the rhetorical and moral support that the U.S. had provided at that time, and they had felt that that had been critical in really allowing them to push the boundaries in civil society.
I had the impression, having been in the Arab world a long time, that maybe because of the lack of underlying legitimacy, in the Arab world people tend to flaunt their corruption, whereas in the West we try to hide it perhaps. But was the corruption really as bad as some of the press indicated?
I think the corruption was as bad, if not worse, even than we really thought that it was at that time. However, it was not something that the government flaunted. In fact, of course, any mention of it in the press would have been censored. So it was something that people talked about in rumors. It was very difficult to get a handle on the picture, but of course now that the government has left and there's been an accountability process undertaken, it was actually much worse than we actually thought it was.
And Mr. Cretz, you had a very different experience in a way. Your embassy wasn't in the country, and you had to move in and do it kind of on the fly. Can you tell us about the experiences you faced in Libya, which of course was perhaps the most violent of all of these three?
Well, I think one would start off, I think, by saying that we all knew the nature of the Gaddafi regime, and without any prejudice to WikiLeaks, I think that the overt information that a very talented staff that I was blessed to have was able to, I think, we knew all the problems, we knew all the warts of the Gaddafi rule for those 42 years. But if you were to ask anybody, even on the eve of that revolution, starting on February 17th, the day before, if anybody would have predicted that the Libyans would have risen up, I found one person, basically, since I went back in September and was asking people, did you think this was going to happen? And I found one person who said, I thought it would happen, but there was no, there was no telltale sign. It's quite remarkable, and I think that you had to have lived there to understand the impact, the psychological, social, political, economic impact that this man, Muammar Gaddafi, exercised over Libya for those 42 years. It was almost like a metastatic cancer that just, it is everywhere. And to a large extent, it explains a lot of what you see in Libya today in the post-revolutionary period. But I can get to that later on if you want. But just in terms of the Foreign Service, what we provided, what this staff of mine provided was very unique. I had been, as you know, I left Libya in December at the end of December of 2010 because of WikiLeaks. That was a problem that Gaddafi just could not overcome. There was just too much information about him that he believed had been let out in public and about his regime, and he blamed me personally for it. So I left, in the best tradition of the Godfather, he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I thought that I was through with Libya, quite honestly, until, of course, the revolution started. And then our team then ceased operations and we evacuated in the end of February. But that whole embassy literally was transferred back to Washington as a unit, which I'm told is unprecedented. We'd had other situations around the world for many years where embassies had gone to other places, for temporary shelter and all this. But our whole embassy literally was transferred back here. And in effect, because we had been out of Libya since 1981, and we started to go back in 2003, 2004. So for 22, 23 years, we had no information base about Libya. But the information that this very actually young team that I had done over the 2 years that I was there, we in fact were able to act as a very effective policy advisory group to the President and the Secretary of State when Libya exploded, because nobody knew anything about the place. And so for those 8 months of the revolution, my staff was contacting people. We had contacts in the Western Mountains. We had contacts in the East. We were talking to everybody we knew and getting a very, very good information base, which eventually, I think, led to the increasing the comfort level of the Secretary and the President to make that fateful decision in March to intervene with military force. And so if we're going to talk about what the Foreign Service is and what it means and what the value of the Foreign Service is, I would say please look to this example of Embassy Tripoli during that period, because I think it reflects the best of the Foreign Service, and it shows Congress, it shows the President, it shows everybody in America just exactly what we do best, and that is to know a place and to give our best assessment of what's happening in that place. And I think at the end of the day, the contribution that the team made was really quite essential and quite relevant for the policy decisions, the very tough policy decisions that the President and Secretary of State had to make during those very difficult times.
Were you able to use any other means? I mean, since you were not on the ground, to keep in touch? I mean, you were able to contact people by telephone and so forth?
We used mainly telephone, and what we didn't know, I was in contact with many of the officials who had gone over to the new National Transitional Council, because I had known them in their previous capacity when they were working in Tripoli. And there were a few times, in fact, when they thought that they were on secure phones, they told me they were on Thuraya and it was secure. And then later we saw Gaddafi playing tapes of myself talking to some of the people in Benghazi. But it was beyond just phones. We were traveling The secretary early on asked me to travel. I went to Rome and I went to Cairo early on in the, about maybe 10 days before the vote at the UN, to get a feel for exactly what was happening on the ground in terms of these of this revolution. Who were they? Because you heard all the propaganda coming out from the Gaddafi side that this was Al-Qaeda and this was Islamic jihadists, and nobody had any real comfort. Nobody had any real confidence at that particular point in what we, the embassy, were saying. This is a national rebellion. It's not a civil war. But slowly, I think, through travel and through these different contacts, we were able to bring the comfort level of the president up to the point. And then I think it was clinched, quite honestly, in Paris about 4 days before the vote, when the secretary had the first opportunity to meet Mahmoud Jibril, at that time who was the prime minister of the transitional council, and he gave a very effective and very moving portrayal of just who the opposition was and just what the danger they were in as Gaddafi's tanks and troops were at the doors of Benghazi.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps we should move on now to the current situation, which is a lot more, perhaps even more complicated, where we are. And let me say, we'll start with Tunis, perhaps. And where do you think the situation is now? Especially, people give most attention to the role of the different Islamic parties. Mm-hmm. And so much of this, now people are focused on their own internal affairs, not on foreign actors. But we see difficulties in all countries. In Tunis, perhaps still a great debate, I think, over the role of Islam and the form of government they should have. How do you see the situation currently, and how do you think the embassy and foreign service are dealing with it?
Right. Well, of course, Ennahda, which is an Islamist party, did win the Constituent Assembly elections in October by a pretty decisive margin at about 40%, far larger than any of the other political parties. And you're right that the role of religion in society is one that I think Tunisians are trying to grapple with now. Of course, under Ben Ali, there was not much room for free expression of religion, and so I think now you're seeing a debate which should have happened a long time ago is now kind of playing out, particularly as Tunisians are trying to write the new constitution. In terms of where things stand now, I'm very optimistic about the direction of Tunisia, and I think that one of the things that really made me feel optimistic when I went back to Tunis in February was that people from all walks of life in Tunisia are suddenly interested in and participating in the political process. When we were in Tunisia 2006 to 2008, and probably prior to the revolution, I think most Tunisians were pretty apathetic about the political situation. I think that they felt probably very hopeless that there was any opportunity for change. And many of them in private might be willing to share their political views, but it certainly were very frightened to be able to express any of those political views more publicly. And today Tunisians are following the news, they're following the constitution drafting process, and so I feel very optimistic that even though I'm sure the road ahead is going to be difficult, that Tunisians are now paying attention to the political situation, and as things head in a direction they're uncomfortable with, they will express their views. Of course, I think one of the major challenges in Tunisia is the economy, and which was an important factor which allowed the revolution to take place. And I think that improvements in the economy are really going to depend upon improvements in the political situation, and in Tunisians and foreign investors really having confidence that Tunisia is headed in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Tunisia did not have as large a population growth, I think, as the other countries, but it's certainly been huge. I saw a statistic February 11 that 50% of our Arabs were 24 years of age or younger. But do you think the government is able to deal with the economic problems? Of course, the tremendous loss of tourism over this trouble.
Well, I do think it's going to be quite difficult. However, I think one of the big problems, one of the big political problems, which also became an economic problem, was corruption. And there is a process underway to deal with kind of the remnants from the corruption of the previous regime. And that really, I think, will restore a lot of confidence among Tunisian investors and foreign investors as well, that you know, the rule of law will be respected in the economic sphere as well. But I think that there is a need for economic reform in Tunisia, and I think it's going to be a slow process. This is a new government, and of course, most of the people serving in the government don't have, or at the top levels of the government, don't have prior government experience. So I think it's going to be a learning process, but Tunisia is a country full of a lot of really capable business people, lawyers, economists, and so I'm confident that they have the human capacity in order to make the changes necessary to push the economy forward.
Libya, in contrast, seems to, of course, have a much greater danger of violence and perhaps even breaking apart. How do you think we were able to cover that, and how do you see the situation now?
Well, I think if you followed the headlines from the major news organizations over the past several months, you would get a picture of a place that, number one, in which militias are running rampant, number two, in which secessionist forces are working very hard, number three, in which there are you know, economic dissolution, economic, you know, an economy that is just not working, not functioning, and a place that is being overrun not only by man-pads, but by Al-Qaeda and Islamic jihadists. And to a great extent, I mean, let's be honest, there are, this new government faced a lot of problems. Don't forget that Gaddafi, in his genius, and that was his genius, never allowed any institution to come up in any way, shape, or form that would be able to counter him or his regime in any way for 42 years. So consequently, when Tripoli fell very quickly on August 21st, to everyone's surprise, the council was not prepared to start, you know, the governing of the country. They didn't have institutions, and there was no army. That dissolved. The police dissolved. The bureaucracy, for what it was just a sham. So they, in fact, really had to start from zero, and that's what they've done. Because the militias played such an important part in the revolution, in effect, they were powerful little fiefdoms, and they continue to be, because the government has had a difficult time, you know, convincing them to put their arms down and to come into an army, into a police force, in order to take jobs or go to universities or whatever. So you do have a problem of a lack of government authority. But at the same time, one can also say a few things. Number one, the government that was sworn in on November 1st, headed by Prime Minister El-Kiba, is a very solid one. It's technocrats. They're very competent people. The problem is that they have been very reluctant to engage in wide-scale or intensive decision-making because they are a transitory government. And they knew that there would be, by law, an election on June 21st or June 19th, and they would be phased out. So they didn't want to leave the new government with any kind of things that were that they couldn't change, whether it be treaties or whatever. And so that also played into the area of money. Libya, the saving grace for Libya will be that it's not going to be a basket case. Their assets were unfrozen. Their oil is almost back to pre-war levels, 1.6 million barrels a day. And so, despite this, the government was very reluctant to spend money because of the shadow of corruption that continued to, you know, to be part of the Libyan landscape as a legacy of the Gaddafi era. So you do hear a lot of bad stories, and you know, the government will be honest that there have been human rights abuses, not officially sanctioned, but because of the you know, the diffusion of power throughout the country, you do have militias, in charge of jails, and they tend to perhaps engage in some abuses acknowledged by the government. But at the same time, in addition to the oil, which is back up to levels, you have a process moving inexorably toward elections. No matter what has happened in the last 9 months of this revolution, despite the problems, despite the strife, despite the fights that you heard in all different parts of the country, they are moving inexorably toward a democratic election. And so at the end of the day, that will signal the end of the revolution, and that will then be the beginning of real governance in Libya. So I think that if one is careful and one is willing to go into the details of what's really happening, one can be optimistic. It's not going to be easy. There are still these fractures that are relics of the Gaddafi era. They're not easy to overcome. You still have Saif al-Islam in prison. You have pressure to do high-profile court cases and trials, etc. But at the end of the day, I can't tell you what an experience it has been to have been a diplomat for the first time in a career, and I don't know how many else of us in this room or throughout the Foreign Service can say that they have been there when you have witnessed a people breathing freedom for the first time. And no matter what problems they have, no matter whether it's economic, political, social, whether there's violence or what, there is a spirit of unity, of revolutionary unity that binds them. And at the end of the day, they will be able to overcome their problems one at a time, although there will be setbacks. But remember that what we did was to intervene along with our allies, and they really understand what freedom is. And that's a gift that we in the international world, international community, help give them, obviously in tandem with their own spilling of blood during those horrible 8 months.
Well, Embassy Cairo certainly has a full plate these days with the Mubarak verdict, demonstrations again in Tahrir Square, the disputes still going on about the presidential election, in which you have two starkly different candidates. How do you see the current situation? How the embassy is prepared to deal with that?
Well, it's still very, very much a work in progress, like all of these countries. It has been extremely boisterous from the very beginning. The return to Tahrir Square has been a recurrent feature of this revolution, both in response not it's on now.
Yeah.
Okay. The return to Tahrir Square has been a recurrent feature of this ever since the beginning, and it has been, I have to say, rather effective in getting attention to many of the issues. We have seen the authorities revise positions and change direction in response to this. But they have, as I said, as kind of chaotic as it can sometimes look, they also have made significant progress toward returning government control to an elected capacity. They have had parliamentary elections that I think enjoyed popular legitimacy. It has elected a new political leadership in the parliament that are ready to lead. And they are in the midst of concluding a presidential election. And the military authorities continue to make very clear that they intend to hand over power to the elected president. The biggest challenge they have, of course, is they don't really have a constitution. The military suspended the old constitution after having a referendum amending parts of it. They have a process that is currently trying to be activated and resolved as to who is going to sit and draft this constitution. It will then presumably have to have a referendum to be approved. So they have made a lot of progress, but they still have this enormous challenge of figuring out how they're going to govern themselves. Egypt has, a reality of Egypt, as any of you who have visited or served there, is it has a very strong state. The political system can be very chaotic looking to us, but these state institutions are by and large still operational, still providing if imperfectly much of what the people expect and need from their government to be provided. Our embassy is still an up and running, fully engaged, large operation with a robust security assistance program, an aid mission, a very active public diplomacy section with outreach, and we have certainly made clear at every single opportunity our willingness and desire to support Egypt and Egyptians through this transition. While at the same time, and this has been a theme publicly and privately throughout this from us, is that this is very much an Egyptian process. It isn't about us. We're not taking any credit for what has happened, although we have consistently offered support wherever it is needed. I know we are also looking at ways with others to try to help the Egyptians jumpstart their economy. They have some significant economic resources that prior to this were actually attracting a good deal of foreign investment. But they've got to, I think, conclude this constitution writing and getting this political transition complete to create a climate where both domestic and foreign investors feel comfortable putting new money into Egypt so they know at least what the rules of the road are going to be. I think that is perfectly within their reach. But as I said, they've got to complete the constitutional process to be able to figure out how these new elected leaders are going to work with each other and how this power is going to be distributed. But as I said, it's not over, and I think there are lots of decisions. This will take a great deal of time for people to work these things out. They've got a lot of decisions to make about their economy, not only their political process. There's a pent-up demand for social justice. But yet they also understand that they have got to create a climate, as I said, for investors to want to put new money into Egypt. So it's going to be, I think, a challenging period for Egyptians, but they remain quite confident, I think, that it's in their hands that they will take it forward.
The so-called, at least in our terms, secular parties seem to be divided and are regretting their division because they're out of the running for president. Do you have any sense that the shock will strengthen the secular forces, the modernist forces, if you will?
You know, I haven't been back in Egypt now for almost a year, so I'm not sure I have my finger exactly on that pulse. But it has been a challenge prior to the events of last January, February. The so-called legal opposition was also fractured. It was many of these long-established parties had more or less accepted the status quo with the regime, and there was a great deal of popular questioning about some of the existing. I mean, there were dozens of political parties. They just didn't have much of a. They had almost no grassroots organizations. So this has been a real process for groups that, prior to the events of last January and February, just simply had a very minimal ability to operate as a modern political party. So I think it's going to take some time for Egyptians to sort of organize themselves for the future. I mean, in any transition, it's not only the first election, it's the second, third, and future elections. I think they all understood this was going to take time. They've got to organize themselves politically, I think, toward the future. But there were new political parties that came up after the fall of the regime. Many of them tried to make some coalitions, but I think that they were looking at what you did have was the very large and previously very well organized at the grassroots level nationally, the Muslim Brothers, who, even though tried to distance themselves a little bit from the political process, they had a very well-known party. So they had such a head start and advantage. I think it's not surprising what has happened. But the good news is, as I said, the press and the media in Egypt remains wide open. And as long as these freedoms and capacities for people to express themselves remain free, the opportunities are there for Egyptians to continue to develop their political identities and organizations.
Well, going back to Libya then for a minute, how much can we look in the future? I think with all of these countries, what can you see in terms of the end game, if much of anything, And how long do you think it will last? Is it something likely to last most of this decade before things settle down, or are we in for a much longer period of instability before the country can begin to function as a normal quote-unquote country should?
When Secretary Clinton visited Libya in October, she went to Tripoli University, and one of the students got up, it was a town hall setting, and said to the secretary, how do we build a nation when we don't even know what politics is? Because they had never experienced it. So, just like in Egypt and just like in other countries, this is going to take a while. But I have to tell you that having been in Libya in the pre-revolution phase, and then having had the opportunity to go back for the past 9 months, the level of intellectual discourse is absolutely astonishing compared to what we experienced before. The NGO community is thriving. Women are asserting their authority. Youth are asserting their authority. It's really a very, very vibrant country that we really didn't know existed, because it didn't exist until February 17th. And so they're experimenting as they go along the way. The Islamists are going to have a role in this country. And Libya is a very conservative Islamic country in terms of its values, but they are not by nature jihadists or extremists, and we won't see that kind of country emerging. But we will see a democratic country emerging with an Islamic face to it of some kind. Some of it we'll like, some of it we won't like, but I think at the end of the day, they will be a democracy. They know what they had before, and they certainly understand the concept of democracy. They have made mistakes along the way. I mean, they've when they were trying to formulate an election law, they first started out with a quota for women, and then there was a backlash against that by the country, and they changed it around. Whether or not that will result in any more than the 20 women who would have been in the 200-member Congress that will be elected in June remains to be seen. But I don't think we have a real sense of what is going to emerge or who are going to emerge as the new leaders. A lot of the leadership right now are people who either who served in some capacity in the Gaddafi government before, and they will largely have to leave the scene. You have a lot of people who lived outside the country, in the United States, etc., and who brought these ideas that they had learned from the West, which is very positive. But we don't know who the grassroots leaders are. We don't know this population of 6 million because they haven't really had a chance to come up from the fore yet. So I think what we can expect after this election is going to be still uncertainty. They will elect 200-member people Congress. That Congress will then choose 60 people to write the Constitution. The Congress will also choose another temporary government for a year. And in that year period, they will submit the Constitution for a referendum, and there will then be a final election at the end of that period, which will elect a permanent government. So this is going to be a work in progress, to be expected, because they're starting literally from nothing. But the point also is that they've got friends. We are very active in the democracy and governance field. The French, the British, all the Europeans are helping very much, and they want our help. And so I think at the end of the day, we're going to see a democracy emerge out of Libya. As I said, it's going to be a kind of a zigzag process, not a straight line. But I think at the end of the day, this is going to be something that we can all be proud of as Americans for having involved ourselves directly in this process.
Well, Egypt, in contrast, we're fond of saying has been a country for 5,000 years. Where do you think they're going? And certainly the Islamists also are very prominent in the future of Egypt.
Well, I think that the one thing that we can be certain of is that the Egyptians have expressed themselves very, very clearly. They do not want to return to an autocratic sort of one-man rule. Now, the options that are multitudinous. And as I mentioned before, the real issue is they need to come up with a constitutional process that the broad population can get behind and support. I think Egypt has a lot of questions to resolve. There's a lot of pent-up economic demands that need to be met. And as I said, I think this is going to take a number of years for them to do this. It's Gene mentioned it's not a straight line. It's hard for me to sort of to know exactly how this looks to all the Egyptians that are watching this. It has sometimes seemed very chaotic. As I said, they're constantly going back to Tahrir Square. But this seems to be a process they need to go through to be able to have everyone's voices heard. There are issues that will have to be debated in Egypt as to what the proper role is of religion in the state. That is certainly something that will be out there, although the mainstream of the Muslim Brotherhood has continued to say that they understand that Egypt is a multi-religious, has a diverse population, and all Egyptians need to be respected. Egypt does have a strong sense of nationalism, and I do think that there are very strong institutional capacity. Again, it may not always be the most efficient, but it is there. It is a real bulwark that I think the citizenry depends on. Will help provide a degree, and the military, the kind of stability and support that will help the political process move forward.
Well, Tunisia, if anything, may not be easy, but at least as a well-ordered country and a well-educated population, if they can solve their economic problems, probably is in the best position of all three.
I think that's correct, and I think a lot of people have pointed to Tunisia as the country with the best chance for success, and certainly, I think that Tunisia has the institutional capacity. The government ministries remains largely intact, and so I do feel very positive about the future for Tunisia. But certainly there are challenges. I think for many Tunisians used to life under the Ben Ali regime, things do seem chaotic under democracy. Whereas before there were no protests or strikes, suddenly, every day or every week you might have a group of protesters or strikers out expressing their views on a certain issue. And so, while that may be frustrating to a lot of Tunisians right now, ultimately I think that's a sign of the success, of the vibrancy of the democracy that Tunisia is trying to put into place right now. But I do think that there are challenges right now in kind of defining the proper role for Tunisia for religion in society. And I think that you see that playing out right now. There are some violent protests by small Salafist groups. There have been some issues with freedom of the press. And so I think that those are all things that we need to pay attention to. And I do think that there's a role for the U.S. and for our embassy on the ground both to monitor and be aware of the trends that are happening in the country, but also to provide support to the government as they need technical expertise. The administration has offered to provide a lot of financial assistance, and certain that's really welcomed by the Tunisian government and the Tunisian people in order to support the transition. And then I think, as well, it's important for us to remain engaged and to stand up for democracy and human rights issues as those emerge as well. Because I think that, as Tunisia is trying to determine the role for religion in society and determine the boundaries of the democracy in the country, I think that our voice can be helpful to those who are part of either the opposition or the journalists in the country.
Well, there's a lot ahead, I think, but I think now it's really your turn to ask some questions of the panel on these three countries. So please, if you would come to the microphone, and it's just behind you here. Please use the microphone. It's right behind you. We need to use the microphone because it's being recorded.
In a recent article in the New York Review of Books, there was an article on Libya, and its two main points were that Benghazi is under the control of the militias, and Tripoli has very little influence there, and that in the West, there was a Berber resurgence. I was wondering if the ambassador could comment on either of those two trends.
I think what we've seen in Benghazi, including this Barca statement, which amounted to kind of a secessionism back several months ago, I think you see a continuing sense from the East that they, just as they were in the period of Gaddafi, they are being ignored by the new state of affairs. And by their own admission, I think the new government has acknowledged that they have not done what they could have or should have done with respect to making decisions to make the Easterners feel that they were part of the new Libya. But they know that that's a problem, and they know they have to work on that. So I think that what we have seen in Benghazi is a manifestation. It is one that they need to be concerned about, but I don't think it's a critical point right now. I think the election will solve a lot of that particular problem. With respect to the Berbers, Berber flags are flying all around the country. They're speaking their language. I think that the Berbers, the Berbers at least that I've spoken with, I've been to Yefren several times since I was back. They have complaints, of course they do, because they think that they're entitled to a bigger share of the country, especially for all that they suffered during the Gaddafi years when their language and culture was totally repressed and suppressed. But I think by and large they will have representation in the Congress, and I think that they will. I think that they will find that their situation will steadily improve in this new Libya.
Hi, I'm Beth Lampron. I was posted to Tunisia in 1999 to 2001. I covered human rights, and mostly my contacts were the militants démocratiques, including President Marzouki and Mustafa Ben Jafar, who are the head of that parliament. And so I have been following Tunisia with great interest, and your article is excellent, and I thought it was very frank. And so I don't actually have a question, I just have some observations. As I follow what's going on since the fall of Ben Ali and the events across the region, I am concerned about the use of blasphemy laws to stifle any freedom of discussion of religion in these countries. In March 2012, two men were convicted in Tunisia for blasphemy, for printing books that questioned the religion of Islam. Also, there's a video that has been circulating quite recently, and it came off of a program in Egypt, and the Egyptian's television person said that it was a Tunisian man and he was being beheaded for apostasy in Tunisia. It's not clear if he's in fact Tunisian. However, it is clear from the video that they were beheading the man for apostasy. And so I think that I am very concerned about freedom of religion and freedom for apostates. I think that as Americans, as diplomats, as the U.S. government, that we need to support freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, and we need to support freedom of the press and also the rights of women.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. I actually wanted to ask a broader question of sort of all the panelists, and that is that Victoria mentioned the sort of broad perception of the Arab model, at least before the revolution, was unsustainable. And I think now, in the wake of the Arab Spring, from a USG perspective, it's almost a truism that business as usual is no longer sustainable. But I think we've come under a degree of criticism for the extent to which we've been able to operationalize our new approach in terms of inclusivity, bringing in gender considerations, and particularly broadening engagement beyond government-to-government interaction to include civil society. with respect to Jordan, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, sort of the big ones. And I guess my question is, given the political dynamics we operate in, does the nature of realpolitik fundamentally constrain our ability to operationalize the new approach that we would like to see? If that makes sense.
Well, I guess reality is the business of the Foreign Service. Margaret, would you like to?
Well, I think that in every country there are can be constraints on things that we want to do based on our own desires and interests and perceptions. But I would say that what I've seen, I saw it in Egypt before this regime change, and it is certainly carried on now, a real commitment on the part of the President and the Secretary to do everything that we can to support those who seek our support and want our support, and to try to speak to those kinds of universal principles and the freedom of civil society. But I think we are also, it is not only governments that sometimes step in, there is also popular views as to what the proper role of foreigners has been, I mean, in these societies. So I think we have to be respectful and allow these countries to make their own choices and to lead. You see in Egypt, Gene was talking about it, in Libya, you see a real explosion of both political and civil society activity. It's there, it's ready to go. We are there on the ground, certainly offering support and help. And as I said, there's no question but that the President and the Secretary are committed to doing what we can to advance women's rights, to advance respect for human rights, and the support for civil society. So I think we will continue to do that, but certainly there are constraints. And I think you can't deny that. But if you propose to go forward to the degree that you can, given both popular and sometimes governmental obstacles, I think you can still continue to make progress.
If I could just add as well, I think speaking to the Tunisian example, I think one of the misperceptions that I've often noted in a lot of writing about Tunisia was that the U.S. had this really excellent relationship with the Tunisian government. And having served there, 2006 to 2008, I can tell you that actually the Tunisian government, and there's no love lost between the U.S. Embassy and the Tunisian government at that time, despite what might have been the public perception. And in fact, the Tunisian government made our jobs demonstrably more difficult in numerous ways, and our support of opposition political parties and our engagement with civil society activists actually increased, I think, the ire that we received from the Tunisian government. So, I just say that to point out that sometimes I think it's difficult to see kind of what's happening behind the scenes, and certainly there are a lot of heated exchanges on democracy and human rights issues that happen behind closed doors that may not be as visible to the public, and that a relationship that may seem very positive on the surface could have a lot of tension behind the scenes.
Gene, did you?
Yeah, I think if you looked at the Arab Development Report, I think, which came out 2008, 2009, which was an effort by the UNDP, I believe, to allow Arab analysts, Arab professors, academics, economists, to take a look at the Arab world and take a look at the various indices of social wellness in terms of security, personal security, economic security, political security. I think that we found that there was a whole list of issues that each of our countries certainly suffered from, and that we can agree that those factors probably extended, with few exceptions, to most of the countries of the Arab world. And I think a lot of what we've seen in the last year and a half is a result of those particular issues. But at the same time, we also have seen the limit of what you called, I guess, an Arab model. Because this sounds trite because it's been said over and over again, but we can't use a cookie-cutter approach to these different issues. That's why, from the start, I certainly was asked, and the questions have been around, why can't we do the same thing in Syria that we did in Libya? Why do we have to treat them differently? Because the circumstances are so unique to each of those places. So I think that even though we can agree that there are core issues in each country that the United States will have to deal with as time goes on, I still think that there's not going to be a cookie cutter approach that will apply to each of them, and that we have to take each of the, I think the Secretary called it soft power, in terms of taking all of our different diplomatic, economic, military tools out of the toolbox at a particular point at which we think they'll be most effective for each individual circumstance.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for coming. Ambassador Cretz, I led a rifle platoon in Baghdad in '03, and I share your sentiments on that liberating a people from oppression is something to see. And my question is, during a period of unrest and civil rebellion, can you talk to us about what kind of interaction you had with the military and the Marines that were off the coast while you were getting ready to evacuate, and what role the military played in helping you safely evacuate? And Ambassador Scobey, you said that you had very little ability to move around Cairo and outside the city. Can you talk about the role of the security contractors that were assigned to the embassy as part of the Worldwide Protective Service, and what assets you would need so that you could move more freely in that sort of environment, if at all possible?
Well, first, yeah, I had left Tripoli at the end of December, so I was not there for the evacuation. But obviously there was a lot of interaction between the embassy and AFRICOM at the time. But the embassy literally went out on commercially rented ferries and commercially rented aircraft. But during the time that our special envoy, who's now our ambassador in Libya, Chris Stevens, arrived in Benghazi, I think that there was more stepped up cooperation. And certainly in the time that I returned in September, we had an SST team that was with us that proved very useful when it came time for several events, including the evacuation of the Libyan wounded from Tripoli. We used Air Force assets from Germany, and also the helping the Libyans to dispose of a 1,000-pound bomb that was in the middle of the Gaddafi compound in Libya, whose fuse was very close to being blown up, and with kids playing and rolling on it, rolling it around. So the military obviously was very close, and our military-to-military relationship with Libya is now building up actually every day, starting with dialogue, elemental training, and we hope that it'll expand even further.
As to, we never had private security contractors and still don't in Egypt. The period what I was talking about was relatively short-lived. I mean, you all will recall, I think it was on the 28th of January, the police simply dissolved. And so you had curfews. So you literally could not go out after dark. And it was very unclear as to what the security situation was. There were, the military had told the citizens, protect yourselves. So they had set up, very effectively in most cases, sort of neighborhood watches, and they were challenging people. So, but you never could tell whether this was a benign neighborhood watch or something else. So, I mean, caution was the word, but we, it was all our RSO. We had a fairly robust RSO staff, and they did an incredible job of trying to keep eyes and ears, and our ability, because most of our families and our employees lived a good way away from the embassy, so we had to start, for a while, put people in embassy vehicles and sort of shuttle them back and forth as opposed to them driving around. That lasted for a few weeks. As I said, it took much longer than we anticipated for the police to get back and running, but our RSO shop did a great job of continuing to check where the boundaries were so that we could eventually get back and running and be able to sort of move not only throughout the city but throughout Egypt when we needed to travel. So it was a relatively short period of time, but we essentially relied on our Egyptian staff and our RSO shop. We had a slight augmentation of Marines inside the embassy compound, but we've never had private security contractors there.
Thanks so much.
Hi, my name is John Franklin. I'm a specialist with the State Department and an aspiring FSO. My question concerns the fact that the Arab Spring appears to have leapfrogged over Lebanon and taken root in Syria. We're all familiar with the conflict that's going on there right now. What do you see being the spillover effects, if any, on Lebanon as the Syrian conflict drags on? Will this create more instability in the region? Will this be something that they're able to stay largely removed from in the near term? What are your projections, if any, on what the likely impact this is going to have?
I'd like to take on Lebanon.
Thank you for being here.
I mean, keep in mind the Lebanese had their Arab Spring a little early, back in 2005, when they began to have a much more dynamic political environment. But I'm not really, I think, capable of speaking to what's going on, I mean, other than what I'm reading in the newspaper, which is there is some spillover of violence into Lebanon.
Well, you know, historically, Lebanon is a saying. It was recently in the newspaper, of course, again, that every time Syria gets a cold, Lebanon gets pneumonia. But that's always been very true. It's constantly, the United States worked very hard to get the Syrian military forces out of Lebanon, but there are still Syrian intelligence forces, to my knowledge, as a retiree. And of course, right now, there's a good deal of violence going on. When the French formed the country, they mixed all kinds of Muslims and Christians together to get a viable state, although Christian dominated. And right now there are fights going on between anti-Assad forces and pro-Assad forces, especially in the north, where you have Alawites as a spillover. And certainly, you know, we had the Cedar Revolution. At one point I said, who chopped it down? But Hezbollah seems to have chopped it down. And there's no doubt that Hezbollah is much stronger in Lebanon. Lebanon is almost split now and in a vulnerable position. The Lebanese somehow managed to keep going. I remember when the Civil War violence got so well, some Lebanese were making a fortune in scrap metal. You know, the Lebanese are wonderful at surviving, but everything that happens in Syria, and I think they're very worried about.
One question for all of you, it's the same question. You all speak of democracy marching forward in each of these countries, and you each say that these countries have yet to write a constitution. Tell me, what kind of democracy? U.S.-style representative democracy or European parliamentary democracy?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Would you like to start, Gene?
Yeah, I at this particular point, I think it's just too early to say what will emerge out of Libya. I think they'll look for the best of what they can find in these different areas. They have a lot of people who have lived for several years in England, they've lived in France, United States, and I think at the end of the day they will try to find some conglomeration of Islamic values and principles alongside Western democratic principles. And I just can't predict what it's going to look like at this particular point.
I would say more or less the same for Egypt. It's going to be a very Egyptian process, and the outcome is going to be Egyptian. I suspect that there is going to be a strong push to try to limit somewhat the powers of the presidency. They've always had a very, at least in their modern period, very strong executive power, so I think there will be some effort to trim that back. But as I said, I think it is so early in the process now that I wouldn't want to predict.
I expect Tunisia to follow very much a European parliamentary model. Of course, Tunisia has always had a parliament, and it did have elections, even though they weren't free and fair. So I will expect, I think now the government has said, this transitional government has said they'll have parliamentary elections in March. That's about 18 months after formation of this constituent assembly. And I think I saw a couple days ago they've managed to finish drafting the preamble to the Constitution. So it's slow progress, but they are meeting regularly to draft the Constitution as we speak. But Of course, in drafting that constitution, you have to deal with a lot of these issues about the role of Islam in society. So I would expect it's going to be a long process.
Thank you.
There's been a good bit of speculation about the Turkish model. Does anybody seen any evidence of this in these countries? Okay.
Well, I guess I can speak a little bit to it. I worked on Turkey for a little bit. When I was in Tunisia, I think that there is a lot of reverence for the AKP party in Turkey and what they've been able to accomplish from Ennahda, the Islamist party. However, I think that Ennahda views itself perhaps more as the model for the region than the Turkish model, because Ennahda is, Tunisia is Arab and Turkey's not. And so I think that Tunisia does feel a certain level of responsibility, having been the first country to overthrow their leader, and having been anointed, the country with the best chance for success. I do think that Tunisia views itself as having an important role, and that it's not only important for their own country for democracy to succeed, but I think that they do feel the weight of the region and the eyes of the world upon them.
I would sort of add to that although you certainly hear analysts in Egypt and in the region talking about the Turkish model for a country, particularly like Egypt, with a very strong military, I think Egyptians are not looking for any external model. I mean, I think they're very united on the fact that this is going to be Egyptian, and reject the concept that they have to copy or need to copy some other country's process.
Please.
I think that's an excellent way of approaching your own democracy. After all, if you want it to stick, you want it to stay, and if we're telling them what to do, we're going to have a problem. But of course, that's not my question. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for mentioning the consular folks, not only in country, but I'm the president of the Civil Service Association, and my good friend is our senior, Susan, senior advisor. So we believe that we're in the boat together, and the boat is called the big ship of state. And of course, what we do best is, as you said, Ambassador, is to relay what we think is going on the ground to the leaders who have to make a tough decision. And also, at the same time, we help those citizens who are in country. And each of you, in your experience, have probably had trepidations about Americans caught somewhere in country, but you know that there is, in your case, you had your team here, but normally there's the Consular Affairs Bureau who stands up the emergency people to help people out of the country. And so my question is, how do we work this over and over again? How successful are we in merging our two objectives, that is the safety of our Americans, the information that has to get back? How do you assess in each of your countries? We did this in 3 revolutions, springs that we have. That's a question. Thanks.
Well, I think from the Libyan situation, the official presence of the embassy was out of the country. So what we were left with was the stray American traveling for some kind of adventure, hooking up with the militia or whatever, or several of our journalists who in fact, and some businessmen who were also caught as well and imprisoned for long periods of time, sometimes incognito, and then sometimes we just didn't know where they were for several periods of several weeks, etc. But again, through the contacts that we had made, specifically with the Hungarian ambassador, for example, and with the Turkish ambassador, and even with people in Gaddafi's circle, we were able to find out where these people were and get them, in touch with the right people. And eventually, all of them, except for one journalist who was killed during the fighting, was saved. So we worked hand in glove with the citizen services during that time, because obviously the parents were concerned. It was a wartime situation. We had no American presence, but we did have a set of contacts that we were able to establish, which became critical, during the time when we were looking for several female and other journalists who we simply didn't know what had happened to them.
I would say in Egypt, it worked, from what I saw, incredibly well, given the large number of American citizens that we had in country. We were fortunate in that the Egyptian attention was on Tahrir Square. The chaotic situation when the police collapsed complicated everything, but the airport remained open. Things were slowed down. Flights were difficult to get, but the civil aviation continued to operate. But I have to say that, as I said, the RSO shop in our embassy and our consular section did an incredible job of reaching out. We had good networks throughout all the hotels and travel industry to be able to contact people, to be able to find out where people were. And this I don't know what they called them, the flyaway team, but the consular team, they just did it. They came in on a plane, they stayed out at the airport, they set up a processing facility, they wore uniforms, they went around the airport in Cairo to see if there were any stray Americans that were, and it was a really amazing process. And of course, in the background, you have Pat Kennedy pulling all the strings that you need pulled to find out where are the planes and the assets that you need to make sure this can happen. So it was an incredibly fast operation. So we were fortunate, and many private Americans were able to get out on their own. They fortunately didn't need help. But we were able to gin up the capacity to get them out relatively quickly. And as I said, attention was not on foreigners, and violence was not directed. There were some problems right before the regime fell, of sort of last-minute efforts to demonize foreigners, and there were some problems, and certainly some journalists had some violent incidents in Tahrir Square, and they were challenged in a number of places. But for the run-of-the-mill average American citizen in Egypt, they may have seen things going on that concerned them, but they were not themselves the subject of violence. So I said thumbs up to the consular folks that did this.
And of course, I was not in Tunisia actually at the time of the revolution, so I can't really speak to the consular efforts. But I do think the situation, from what I understand, the situation in Tunisia, the security situation was never quite as chaotic as that in Egypt or in Libya.
So one last question.
Hi. I was posted to Tunisia about 10 years ago. I've visited Egypt several times and have lived in 4 other NEA countries. And I was wondering, in your 3 countries, whether you felt that the revolutions that took place there were more anti-Gaddafi, anti-Ben Ali, anti-Mubarak, rather than anti-one-man rule. And the reason I ask that is because all these countries in the Middle East have this tradition of one-man rule, whether it was the monarchy before or whatever came after. And some analysts have argued, well, that's a cultural tradition, and this is what societies want, that's what they accept. So how much of this protest was, just throw the incumbent out and we'll be happy? And is there any kind of groundswell of support or nostalgia for a powerful one-person ruler? Because I hear that from my Arab friends that, we don't like this chaos. We just want a strong ruler who's a decent ruler to come and to make the important decisions and to move our economies and our countries forward.
Let's start with Tunisia.
Well, that's an interesting question, because actually when I was back in February, many of my Tunisian friends, while they have a lot of ill will towards Ben Ali, they still have a lot of reverence for Habib Bourguiba, who of course was the leader for over 30 years, and so they still retain a lot of positive feelings about Bourguiba. However, I do think that there is a recognition that the lack of democracy is what prevented checks and balances that allowed Ben Ali, the excesses of the Ben Ali regime. And so while I do think there is some reverence and some nostalgia for Bourguiba that might be a little surprising, I don't think it's just the figure of Ben Ali. I think there's a recognition that the system that allowed Ben Ali to remain in power also was fundamentally flawed.
As far as Egypt is concerned, there certainly is a degree of desire for things to return to normal. The fact that a former prime minister and minister of Mubarak's government is going to be in the runoff election for president indicates that he had a significant degree of support of people who would seem to want to identify more with someone who's promising stability and law and order. But I do think that Egyptians were united and remain united on the belief that they deserve an ongoing participatory form of government democracy. It was not just, we don't want Hosni Mubarak, it was, we want to govern ourselves. And I think that you sort of knew something had really, really turned a corner one afternoon when you saw what I would consider the ladies who lunch. These are well-dressed Western women who might be in a five-star hotel, leaving their lunch and going to Tahrir Square to join the demands for a change in government. So it really captured a huge swath of Egyptian society, both those who had a stake in the old regime and those that didn't. So I do believe that this was a genuine, long-standing desire that we do not want anymore to be governed by this sort of one person for 40-year rule. That was one of I was never convinced that Mubarak's son was a viable presidential candidate, but I think that's one of the reasons why there was a growing fear that they might try to transfer this model to a second generation, and that just was not acceptable. It's encouraging to hear. Thank you.
I think there's no doubt that the Libyan people understood what democracy was and what the democratic principles were, and they had a model of sorts from King Idris, who they tend to idealize before he was overthrown by Gaddafi. But I think this revolution was Gaddafi-centric. I think that his character, was so, as I said in the beginning, so repressive and so eccentric. And he had a very, people used to say was, if you take a rat and you put it in a bag and you leave the bag stable and don't move it, the rat will gnaw its way out of the bag. But if you continue to shake up the rat, he will be so disoriented that he won't do anything. And in effect, in those 42 years, that's what Gaddafi did, with a mix of ideology, a mix of repression, a mix of change without notice, daily, that people had to adjust to. And so I think at the end of the day that this was really a Gaddafi-centric, and getting rid of him was the key. To say whether or not they could go for a strong win, it's possible. I mean, depending on the circumstances. None of these countries like chaos. It's possible that any post-revolutionary period, chaotic conditions could prevail, and they might be more comfortable with a person who was a strong man, but certainly it's never going to approach the power and influence that Gaddafi had over them during those 42 very strange and very horrible years. Yeah. Strange and horrible at the same time.
Well, thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking
Well, thanks again to everybody. Another fascinating discussion and very timely. We appreciate seeing you. So that's it. I guess after you're dismissed, you can stay and talk amongst yourselves. We don't have a further use today for this room. And thank you all to our panelists. Really.